Isaac Hart presents Ghost in the Museum. Episode 6 Art as Alibi. Sunshine had never felt further away for Nicola than at this very moment, as she stared at the doorstep of the old townhouse. Upon approach from the far end of the street, and later from standing behind the garden wall to peer in uncertainty at the house number, it had looked like any number of grand Edwardian houses that littered the leafier suburbs of Eastbourne. 3 stories tall, large bay windows and whitewashed walls, and a pair of faux Palladian columns either side of the solid dark blue door. It was one of those houses that a century or more ago would have been quite elegant, but now seemed to sag under the weight of the torrential downpour currently soaking it. The pebble-dashed patina of the walls giving the whole place a lumpen, diseased look. It was this general unhappy aura that had made the doorstep so jarring for Nicola, as she squeezed herself as closely to the front door as she dared to escape the rain under the narrow roof of the porch. Looking down at her feet, she had first noticed that the entirety of the doorstep was tiled in the Italian style. Lush green vines and fat juicy lemons that glowed like the sun against an azure blue background formed a repeating pattern up to the foot of the door. For a moment it conjured in Nicola the warm breeze coming off the Mediterranean, and happy memories of the few days' holiday she'd managed to snatch in Sorrento after the curatorial conference in Naples had broken up. She and the other members of the English delegation had taken a boat out to Capri for the day. The air had smelt of lemons, and the green trees against the blue sky had seemed to stretch on forever. It was a fragrant, shining memory, and when it faded, she felt all the greyer and drearier as her eyes flicked to the pale torrent of rain cascading from the sky all about her. The tiles were like a fragment of an alternate universe that had strayed into her own, almost mocking in its jollity. Nicola shook her head, wiping the moisture from her face with the inside of her coat and rooting inside her pockets for the scrap of lined paper where she had written the address. She had scrawled it on her notepad after she had taken the call at the desk in her office at the town art gallery, just as she had sat down that morning. After a moment's blind scrabbling, her hands grasped upon the paper and she pulled it out, holding it up to the tiled house number. This was definitely the place that her friend from the boat trip to Capri had told her that Keris was living now. Keris Rylance. That was a name she certainly hadn't been expecting to hear that morning when she'd gotten the call from Dr. Hampson. Nicola remembered Keris, of course. Who could ever forget her? Even some 20 years after graduation, she could clearly picture Keris lording it over that art curation course like she was the lecturer, contradicting the professor on the finer points of Titian's Venetian altarpieces with such brio that it was almost aggravating when she was inevitably shown to be right. Keris was infuriating, arrogant, and undoubtedly the brightest talent of her entire class, which is what had made it all the more confounding that the procession of high-powered curatorship positions that seemed a near certainty had never materialised. Perhaps it wasn't too much of a surprise, thought Nicola. Keris had always seemed far too sure of her own notions to ever have taken advice, which hardly made her an appealing prospect to run a large publicly funded body at the mercy of a board of trustees. Her one and only professional appointment, to catalogue the Renaissance paintings held in the collection of the Holborn Museum in Bath, had ended abruptly after she had gotten into some kind of dispute with the rest of the team. Something about several old papers suddenly disappearing from the museum's stores, if the gossip among her group of university friends was to be believed. And Keris had promptly quit in a fit of pique. Nicola had always assumed that Keris had finally realised that she couldn't browbeat a curator in the same way she could a lecturer, and had given up in a huff. And that, so far as it seemed, had been that for Keris. She took on a number of junior positions at university libraries in the West Country before she finally seemed to drift away completely from her former classmates. None of them knew what had become of her. Keris wasn't on Facebook or Instagram or even LinkedIn. She wasn't listed as working at any art gallery in the country. She'd been from a well-off family, Nicola remembered that much about her too. Keris's father had been a baronet, a generous donor to their university named Sir Owen Rylance, who had given a very self-important speech at their graduation ceremony, and Nicola had always felt that Keris had looked down at her for attending Cambridge on a scholarship. But Nicola's career had thrived, while Keris seemed to have dropped off the face of the earth. Doing a Keris had become a byword among her old classmates for flouncing out of a party after half an hour. Nicola, for her part, had always assumed that Keris had retreated to some ancestral family pile out in the country, and was dealing old paintings to her fellow aristos in the half-hearted hobbyist manner that people with lots of money and little motivation tended to do. Which is what had made it all the more surprising when Steve Hampson had called her up that morning and told her that not only was Keris living just a few miles away from where she worked at the Towner, but that she was also apparently dying. Nicola had met Steve at the conference in Naples and they had stayed in touch. Over the past 2 years, their conversations had revolved mostly around their respective specialisms: Italian triptychs from the early Renaissance for Steve, prints by Ravilius and Garwood for Nicola. Yet this particular call had carried an undercurrent of something else. As Steve's voice crackled through the phone, Nicola sensed an urgency that belied their usual discussions. Hearing Keris's name, of all things, after so many years had been jarring. Keris had, as it turned out, been in Italy all this time, and Steve had worked alongside her in cataloguing a private collection in Rome 3 months earlier. He'd found Keris odd, and from the sounds of things she had become even odder than Nicola remembered. She'd needled him for information on all manner of seemingly disconnected things, Steve told her. Access to the Vatican archives, the exact processes employed by Masaccio and Uccello in creating their paintings, and most bizarrely of all, how to obtain multiple old analogue television sets. What had prompted him to call, Steve had explained, was that Keris had mentioned offhandedly that she knew Nicola the last time they'd met a few weeks earlier. He'd visited Keris at the house in Eastbourne, only to find that her condition had deteriorated rapidly. Keris was grappling with an aggressive skin cancer, and she'd thrown Steve out angrily when he tried to take her to the hospital. "She won't leave the house," Steve had told Nicola with a mix of fear and bewilderment. "She said that if she leaves, they'll never let her back in. I'm worried she's going mad." There was an unspoken plea in the conversation which Nicola recognised and acquiesced to. She agreed to check in on Keris, a commitment tinged with both sympathy and an unexpected curiosity about the fate of the once proud and boastful student she had known. So here she now was, staring at the beautiful tiled floor as raindrops covered everything else in a dull shimmer. Nicola hesitated for a moment, her hand poised above the antique doorbell. She took a deep breath, her mind racing with the weight of the situation. With a sense of determination, she pressed the button, its shrill chime cutting through the silence of the rain-soaked surroundings. No answer. Nicola frowned, concern etching lines across her forehead. She pressed the doorbell again, this time with a bit more urgency. Through the glazed door, she strained her eyes to catch a glimpse of movement within the darkened corridor. A shadow shifted, and her heart quickened. "Hello? Keris?" Nicola called out awkwardly. "It's Nicola, from university. Steve Hampson sent me to check up on you." Her voice hung in the damp air, met only by the persistent patter of rain. Silence enveloped the scene. Then, through the fogged glass, Nicola discerned a figure, lurking in the depths of the corridor. A presence, barely visible, but undeniably there. "I know you," came a voice, brittle and cold, cutting through the air like a bitter wind. "What do you want?" Nicola startled at the unexpected response. "Keris, it's Nicola. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." Silence lingered for a heartbeat, and then a raspy retort seeped through the door. "Steve sent you?" "Yes," Nicola affirmed, her voice wavering. "He's worried about you. Can I come in?" No immediate response. Nicola strained her ears, hearing the faint click of locks being undone. Lots of locks. Then, with an almost hostile force, the heavy wooden door swung inward, revealing the dimly lit interior. The sight that met Nicola's eyes made her catch her breath. Keres, big, boasting, roaring Keres, now appeared as a ghost of her former self. The woman before her was frail and worn, a stark contrast to the vibrant personality she remembered. Keres's hair, once thick and brown, now hung in thin, patchy strands, with traces of grey decades too soon. The prominent patrician nose seemed exaggerated, almost grotesque, and her eyes bore the weariness of sleepless nights. A chill breeze swept through the doorway, and Nicola struggled to find her voice. "Keres, I didn't expect..." She trailed off, her gaze lingering on the transformed figure before her. Keres's expression remained inscrutable, her scowling eyes fixed on Nicola. "Shut your mouth," she said abruptly, the words cutting through the air like a whip. "You look like a fish." Stunned, Nicola took a moment to compose herself. As Keres turned on her heel, limping back into the dimly lit corridor, Nicola hesitated only briefly before following her into the heart of the once elegant townhouse, now shrouded in an unsettling gloom. Nicola trailed behind Keres as they moved through the dimly lit corridors. The thick curtains drawn across the windows cast the entire place in shadows, intensifying the air of unease that hung about the place like a smog. An odd smell lingered in the air, and as Nicola sniffed, a distant memory flashed before her eyes. The static electricity from dodgem cars at a funfair. The atmosphere in the house felt strange and unsettling, like an electric charge running up the small of her back, a low, infrasound hum, just barely audible. She followed Keres into the kitchen, the faint light from a swinging, flickering light bulb revealing the worn and tired features of someone who had weathered more than just the passage of time. The kitchen, like the rest of the house, seemed frozen in the past. Keres slumped into a chair, already out of breath, while Nicola stood awkwardly, her gaze wandering around the dimly lit room. "How are you?" Nicola finally asked, her concern evident. Keres's face cracked into an unsettling grin. "Spectacular!" she hissed back to Nicola, a look somewhere between contempt and glee spreading across the wasted features. Nicola stuttered, thrown off by Keres's blasé attitude. "Sorry," she muttered, hesitating before broaching the subject that had been on her mind. "Keres, where have you been all these years?" she inquired. "We lost track of you, ages ago. You didn't return any of our messages." Leaning back in her chair, Keres's pride and self-assuredness seemed undimmed by her diminished state. "I've been in Italy, working with private collectors, all strictly off the books," she explained in that same odd, nonchalant tone. "That's where all the really interesting stuff is. You think they just leave the important things on display at a museum where anyone can see them and not understand what they're gawping at, please?" There it was, the same palpable contempt in Keres's voice that had rankled Nicola so much during their university days. She bit her tongue. "Why didn't you reach out to any of us? Especially when you got sick, we could have helped." Keres looked genuinely dumbstruck. "Because I don't like you," she said bluntly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "And none of you like me either." Nicola shifted uncomfortably in her spot, leaning against the cracked cupboards. "That's not fair," she muttered, staring down at her shoes again. Keres gave a derisive snort that transformed into a hacking, painful-sounding cough. Nicola instinctively stepped forward to help, but Keres shooed her away. "Get over yourself," she wheezed through rattling breaths. "You never liked me, any of you. Why should you? I was the know-it-all, remember? The one who kept you all from pissing off early to the pub by, I don't know, actually asking questions? Engaging with the material?" Keres pulled herself back up, squinting at Nicola through the dim light. "It never bothered me, Nick, that you lot didn't like me. I wasn't at Cambridge to make friends. Studying art, that was about the art itself. Not making a little group chat gang." She leaned in, her scowling eyes locked onto Nicola. "Was that what it was for you, Nick? Art as alibi?" Nicola's patience, worn thin by Keres's arrogance, finally snapped. "You know, Keres," she spat out, "having a career and friends at the same time isn't some grand portrayal of the things you love. It's what normal people do. You're so pompous and self-important, and where's it gotten you? Nowhere!" Keres remained silent, a thin line of dribble running down from the corner of her mouth, as if the nerves on her face had lost all power. The gravity of Keres's illness was evident, and Nicola couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. "How long do you have?" she asked, with a more subdued voice. Keres smiled, wiping away the dribble and sighing. "Time?" she said, her voice curling with amusement. "Oh, I've got time, Nick. I've got all the time in the world." Suddenly, Keres leaned forward with a judder, emerging into the light from the ceiling. Nicola instinctively leaped backward, a mixture of fear and surprise on her face. "I've got time!" Keres emphasised each word, a manic glint in her eyes. Nicola was perplexed. "Well, what do you mean?" she asked, bewildered. Keres leaned back, seeming to ponder for a moment, as if she were weighing whether Nicola was worth divulging this particular bit of information to. "Steve didn't mention to you, did he?" Keres said after a while. "Why I sent him away? Stop returning his calls?" Nicola shook her head. He said that you wouldn't go to the hospital with him, that you wouldn't leave the house." Keres rolled her eyes. "Oh, he's so dramatic. Of course I wouldn't go to the hospital with him. What's the point? I don't need to. I have everything I need here." Nicola looked at Keres incredulously. Keres laughed. "Oh, yes, I do," she giggled. "I told him that if he wasn't going to help me with my experiment, then there wasn't much point in him hanging around." Nicola was now thoroughly confused. "Your experiment?" she asked, in a hushed voice. Keres rolled her head to one side and grinned. Slowly, she lifted a thin, shaking hand towards Nicola. "You can give me a hand now," she said. "I want to show you something. I hope you can handle it as well as I have." Nicola followed Keres into the cavernous drawing room, a space even darker than the rest of the house. The air was thick with that acid sting of static electricity, and the same low-frequency buzzing filled the room, making Nicola's hackles rise. "What on earth's been going on in this house?" Nicola asked, squinting to make out Keres's figure in the far corner of the room. The darkness was oppressive, and she struggled to see more than vague shapes. Keres called back, her voice echoing in the obscurity. "Had to block up the windows. Can't have anyone poking their nose in on my work. It's far too important to be disturbed." Nicola's mind raced, considering all the ways she could persuade Keres to leave the house to come to the hospital with her, or else how she could excuse herself and summon help. She couldn't shake the feeling that Keres had indeed descended into madness, as Steve had suggested. As Nicola pondered her next move, the large, ornate chandelier on the ceiling flicked on, momentarily dazzling her. She rubbed her eyes, blinked, and froze to the spot. Nicola's mouth dropped open as she stared agog at the surreal scene before her. In the middle of the ornate drawing room sat a massive, seething mass of electronic equipment. The darkness that had surrounded it had made it nearly imperceptible, but now Nicola could see that it occupied almost the entire room, had been just inches from her face in the blackness. Nicola jumped back, pacing around the ominous machine in bewilderment. It was a chaotic construction of cathode ray television sets, tubes and wires entangled like creeper vines. Bent antennae protruded at odd angles, and mysterious lights blinked from within ancient computer hard drives. The machine seemed alive, seething and fizzing. Deep in the primal recesses of Nicola's mind, something was gnawing, scratching at her fight or flight response, screaming at her that the machine was malevolent. An overwhelming compulsion to flee gripped her, yet she remained rooted to the spot. "Keres," she finally breathed. What is this?" Keres puffed out her chest in triumph, a wicked glint in her eye. "This," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the machine, "is the chronovisor." Nicola stood in the dimly lit room, staring at Keres with sheer bafflement and disbelief. Keres's triumphant smile faltered as Nicola's gaze shifted back and forth between her and the enigmatic machine. "The what?" Nicola finally managed to voice incredulously. "The chronovisor," Keres responded, sounding thoroughly put out. "The only one in the world." Nicola's patience was wearing thin. "And what the hell is a chronovisor?" she asked again, "and why do you have one where a coffee table should be?" Keres spun around, her face contorting into an all-knowing smirk. "What do you know, Nick, about Father Pellegrino Ernetti?" "Never heard of him," Nicola replied flatly. Keres groaned, her thin hands stroking her wasted face. "Christ, am I the only person who actually paid attention in class? Don't you remember Professor Brune from the University of Bologna? He gave a lecture on paintings of Christ's Passion in the 16th century. You were there, you all were." Nicola vaguely recalled the professor, a somewhat scruffy old man if her memory served. "Yes, I remember that one," she said, shifting awkwardly. "He was French, wasn't he? Can't think of what he actually said. It was pretty unremarkable stuff." "It was remarkable," Keres fumed. "I stayed behind after everyone else had left, spoke to Professor Brune for hours. It shaped the whole course of my life." Nicola looked puzzled. "What did you talk about?" Keres's gaze shifted towards the machine, her eyes entranced for a moment. "I asked him about the models, used to depict the crucified Jesus. How were they picked? What was the criteria?" Keres turned her deadly serious gaze back to Nicola. "Brune told me in confidence that none of the models quite captured the look, and he should know. He had seen a photo of Christ's face in 1972. Nicola stood in utter incredulity, swilling the words Keres had just spoken around her head, pulling them apart and recombining them into any order that made a lick of sense. None was forthcoming. "What?" she finally said, the words barely audible. Keres slapped her hands together. "That's exactly what I said!" she crowed, her eyes boggling. "I thought it was some odd joke that didn't translate particularly well from French into English, but he explained it all to me, Nick, and it was like a great big door being shoved open. Ernetti had shown him the photo and told him all he knew, all which he had never told another soul before Brune had gained his confidence in his old age." Turning towards the machine, Keres gestured with her thin, bony arms, almost lost in the sleeves of her loose, ill-fitting jumper. "The chronovisor," she explained, "is a device that allows you to see events from the past. Not just paintings or photographs, but actual events, as if you were there. You tune into the right frequency, echoes of days long gone, and they'll appear on the monitor like an echo, like radar bouncing off a building. You can even capture the impressions of them." The explanation was so outlandish that Nicola wondered whether she really was in Keres's house, but rather slumped at her desk at the Towner, overcome by some terrible gas leak. Finally, she summoned the will to interject Keres's ramblings. "This is bonkers," Nicola snorted. "I might be an art curator, not a physicist, but I know enough science to know that wavelengths don't work that way. They just don't, Keres. The universe isn't some giant recording device, capturing sounds and images. Things happen and then they're gone. That's how time works, Keres. It happens and then it goes." Keres shot around to face Nicola, her eyes wide and scowling. "And how would you know?" she countered. "Maybe it does. Maybe we don't know what time is, how it works. If you're inside a thing and can't get out of it, how can you see what it actually is? What does a goldfish know about the world beyond its bowl? Who do bees think the gassing giant in the white suit is? To them, they're just things that happen. But maybe time isn't something that just happens. Maybe it sticks around. Maybe everything that ever happened is happening everywhere, all at once. Maybe that's what ghosts are. Just recordings that play back over and over and over again. And maybe we can capture them. Maybe we can see, Nick. Maybe we can see them just for a moment. Nicola looked at the chaotic groaning machine, seemingly cobbled together without rhyme or reason. If time really was as fluid as Keres seemed convinced it was, she couldn't make sense of how this ramshackle contraption could see through it in the way she had described. "Keres," Nicola began delicately, "how did you even find this?" "I didn't," Keres declared proudly. "Nettie's original, the one he built with Fermi and von Braun before the Second World War, that was destroyed. The Vatican judged it far too dangerous, confiscated Nettie's designs. No, this one, I built myself." Nicola was utterly dumbfounded. You built it? You built a machine which can see backwards through time? Keres, you're an art conservator, not an engineer, not a nuclear physicist. You patch cracks in oil paintings for a living. How could you possibly build something like this? Keres flashed that wicked grin again. It's amazing what you could do when you're from a very old family with a little money left and know a few very old Italian families with a little money left. Once I knew about the chronovisor, knew that I had to have it, the plan all fell into place very quickly. She sank into a faded leather armchair, her strength seeming to fail again. It was pointless remaining in England long, when what I needed was overseas, Keres began, talking in a low, almost wistful voice as she struggled to regain her breath. Once I'd done all I needed to do here, I sold the old family house in Bath and headed for Rome. I tell you, Nick, it takes a long, long time to ingratiate yourself into the good graces of private collectors, even with my credentials. But I managed, she said, puffing her chest out once more. Oh, I managed. I bided my time, built my reputation. I saw some wonderful things, Nick. Oh, wonderful pieces that have never been near a museum or a gallery, not in 500 years. You'd weep if you knew what you'd been missing out on. That's where I got the tiles for the porch, by the way. Keres suddenly interrupted her own train of thought, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the front door, to where the sunshine-bright lemons and vines lay beyond the darkness of the house. A lovely trip to Positano, valuing a dead old countess's paintings. Simply had to bring them home. They were ever so pretty. Nicola sank down into the chair facing Keres, rubbing her temples. She felt as if she had fallen into a surreal dream ever since she had crossed the tiled threshold of the townhouse. Why was she still there? She thought to herself, still humouring a woman she hadn't seen in 20 years, who had told her to her face that she didn't like her, and who was quite clearly in the grips of a cancer-induced mental breakdown that had gone untreated for months. All she had to do was walk out, head back to her own flat on the seafront like nothing had ever happened. But Nicola couldn't shake the feeling that if she left Keres now, she might be the last person to ever see her at all. She had to find a way to humour her, talk her down, and then, somehow, persuade her to leave the house, to come with her to the hospital. She didn't set out to do a favour for a friend that morning, just to leave a sick woman to die in a dark, lonely house with nothing but a monstrous machine for a companion. Keres seemed oblivious to Nicola's discomfort, or simply didn't care. She pressed on, continuing her rambling story. It took 15 years, Nick, but I managed it, Keres continued. I was inside the Vatican archives. It took several trips, using the guise of cataloguing the miscellaneous architectural plans of the collection before I found what I was looking for. The plans for the chronovisor, just as Brun had said. Ah, what a moment! To hold it in my hands, to know that all those years had been vindicated. I managed to smuggle it out and make a copy, return the original, mixed in with some other old sheaths. I used the last of the family fortune to bribe the nuncio to look the other way. As she spoke, her laughter devolved into a hacking, painful cough. Keres doubled over, her whole body shaking as she hacked and spat, flecks of blood staining the thinning carpet. Keres! Nicola shouted, rushing forward and grabbing her by the arms as she slumped out of the armchair, catching her before she hit the floor. Keres didn't swat her away this time, too weak to even lift her arms. For God's sake, let me take you to the hospital! Keres just laughed and laughed as Nicola lay her on the floor, a thin trickle of blood leaking out of her mouth. I only just realised, Keres groaned, her face contorted with a pained grin. All that work to get to the chronovisor I was finally using Hart as my alibi too, Nick. Just like you. Nicola watched aghast as Keres writhed on the floor. For God's sake, Keres, she pleaded. We need to go to the hospital, you're not well. Keres violently shook her head. No, not now, she spat, wiping away the thin streak of blood running down her chin. I'm too close to the chronovisor working, so close. But why? Nicola asked, exasperated and terrified in equal measure. Why? Why do you want it so badly? What could you possibly need to look into the past for, Keres? Gasping for breath, Keres weakly gestured towards a table in the far corner of the room. Nicola turned from Keres to see that on the table lay what looked like a thin, leather-bound book. Cautiously, Nicola walked over to the table and picked up the book. She turned it in her hands as she carried it back towards where Keres lay. In the light from the chandelier, Nicola could see that the book contained a thin sheath of yellowing papers bound in leather. The spine of the book was held together with a woven cord, and the whole thing felt brittle to the touch. Is this it? Nicola began, intrigued. Where did you get this? Keres smiled weakly. I borrowed it, she whispered slyly. Something in Nicola's memory connected. The Holborn Museum, she breathed, the dots beginning to connect together in front of her eyes. These are the papers you stole. The reason you got sacked. Stole? Bah! Keres snorted derisively. Borrowed, maybe. A long-term loan, perhaps. Anyway, they're actually mine, technically, if you'd like to look at the inside cover. Nicola opened the book, only to close it again just as quickly as a few of the pages almost fell out of the crumbling binding. Keres let out a ragged, amused laugh. Be careful, she hissed at Nicola, flushing that smirk again. Fragile. Handle with care. You're a conservator, Nick. You should know not to be so heavy-handed. Nicola rolled her eyes at the weak joke, but interest compelled her, and she carefully reopened the book and began reading the first page. The last will and testament of Roger Rylance, Esquire, Nicola read aloud, reading the faded, spidery writing on the yellow paper. She looked up at Keres. Rylance. Has this got something to do with your family? Keres snorted derisively. No, complete coincidence, she purred sarcastically. Of course it's to do with my family, Nick. I was the posh one, remember? My father was a baronet. I didn't need a student loan or a scholarship. That last line felt like a particularly pointed barb to Nicola, and she clenched her jaw despite herself. Keres continued. The Rylance baronetcy is, or was, among the oldest in the country. It was in the first batch, created by Charles II after the Restoration 1660, and before that they were Welsh gentry, all the way back to the Normans. It's extinct now, I'm afraid. Died out with dear daddy. She seemed almost rueful for a moment, her grin becoming melancholy. The title wasn't the only thing Father couldn't pass on to me. The money is gone, Nick. Anything we did have, it dwindled to almost nothing over the centuries. Frittered away on art and clothes and expensive rubbish like that. Even the family pile in Bath is gone, Chalcombe Hall. Just this house now. Just this house and me. Me, still here. Nicola, still holding the yellowing pages of the will, couldn't help but feel a sense of impatience. She had been listening to Nicola ramble for what felt like hours now. Was Roger Rylance an ancestor of yours? She asked irritably, wanting to cut to the chase. Keres laughed again, a brittle sound that echoed through the dim room. Something like a 7 times great-uncle. Roger died young, aged 24. Never had any descendants. Died before his father, so the title and the family seat went to his little brother Thomas, who was my ancestor. Nicola sighed. That's fascinating, she said flatly. What does any of this have to do with the chronovisor? Keres regarded Nicola with that familiar, smug, contemptuous look. She leant forward towards Nicola. "What if ghosts aren't just echoes of what have been?" she whispered conspiratorially. "What if it works in reverse, too? What if you can see an echo of days yet to come?" Keres pressed her icy cold hands on top of Nicola's, which gripped the warm pages tightly. Nicola shivered as she felt odd bumps and welts on the underside of Keres's hands. "Nicola," Keres whispered, a ghost of vulnerability creeping to her voice. "I need your help. I need to open a door." It was with a surreal mix of dread and fascination that Nicola gingerly helped Keres into the cockpit-like chair positioned in front of the largest screen on the chronovisor. The lights in the room had been dimmed, plunging it back into almost complete darkness again, save from the soft grey glow from the curved analogue screen that flashed and crackled with static interference. "We've all got our roles to play, Nick," Keres explained, slumping into the cage-like seat. "I need you to watch. I need you to watch what happens on the screen as you read the will, and I need you to remember what you see." Nicola nodded, unsure of what exactly she was agreeing to, or why she was agreeing to it. It was some unnatural compulsion that pushed her forward now, a morbid desire to see what exactly the wounded, deranged Keres had been destroying herself to create. Keres reached out for the clunky control panel of the chronovisor, grimacing with pain as she clenched the handles. "Are you okay?" Nicola asked, knowing even as she said so that Keres was as far from okay as it was possible to be. Flashing that dangerous grin, Keres suddenly extended her hands towards Nicola, who recoiled in horror. In the light from the screen, Nicola could finally see what she had felt earlier. Keres's hands were a mass of scalded, oozing lesions, her decaying, blackening flesh looking as if it had been scalded from the bone. "Surprise!" Keres cackled, waggling her deathly white fingers at Nicola. "Turns out that anything that runs on decayed isotopes needs an awful lot more shielding than Bakelite." Keres had presented the information that the seething mass of machinery before them was radioactive with such nonchalance that it took a moment for the terror to root Nicola to the spot. But reality did sink in, and soon Nicola was more aware than ever of the prickle on her skin, the faint taste of metal in her mouth. "Keres," she whispered, her eyes wide. Have you poisoned us?" Keres waved away her concerns. "Don't lose your cool, Nick. It's only harmful in small doses." Staring at the visible effects of the dreadful damage wrought on Keres, Nicola realised that she must have been working on the chronovisor for months without interruption, considering the advanced state of her radiation-induced cancer. Nicola made a final plea. "It's not too late. We can still go to the hospital." Keres seemed to consider the words for just a fraction of a moment before shaking her head. "We really can't," Keres whispered back. "Neither of us have a choice in the matter. You'll understand. Once you've read the will, you'll understand when the door opens and you see what I've seen. And I've seen astonishing things, Nick. Astonishing things." Keres pulled down on the handles of the control panel. For a moment, Nicola thought nothing was happening, the screen remaining resolutely dark save the odd fizzle of interference. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a small light formed on the screen. The light grew larger and larger, and after around a minute, a faint, flickering image appeared on the curved screen. It took Nicola a moment to recognise what she was seeing, but once she did, her blood seemed to freeze in her veins. There on the convex screen, emerging from the static interference, was the dome of the Duomo di Amalfi, the cathedral of the small Italian town she had visited with Steve and the others for the day, in that fragrant sunny memory that seemed more distant now than ever before. Memories of the place flooded back to Nicola, of the disconcertingly quiet and shadowed courtyard, with its faded paintings of Christ and the Apostles. "The well!" Kerez barked at Nicola without turning to face her, snapping her back to attention. "Read the will!" Nicola opened the book, her hands shaking, and squinted at the faded letters in the light of the dim monitor. In the name of God, Amen," Nicola read aloud, her eyes flicking between the page and the screen. "I, Roger Rylance, Esquire, being of sound and disposing mind, do make and declare this my last will and testament, in the manner and form following. I, of the age of 24 years, and a Welshman of noble birth, do hereby recount the events that transpired in these, my final days of my earthly sojourn, which did truly occur in the town of Amalfi in this year of our Lord 1774. Upon the 18th day of August, my esteemed tutor Mr. Greaves of Cambridge and I arrived in provincial Amalfi, my constitution weakened by the malevolent grasp of malaria since our sojourn in Naples compelled me to rest in this picturesque abode before my departure to Bari and thence to the shores of England." Nicola paused, shaking her head in disbelief. It had to be some sort of trick and elaborate work of modernist art constructed by Kerez in her delirium. How could the images on the screen seem to be beamed from the 18th century? "This can't be real," Nicola muttered under her breath. Kerez, watching the screen intently, responded with a manic gleam in her eyes. "Oh, it's very real, Nick. The chronovisor, my creation, it works. It works. Witness the echoes of the past and the last days of Roger Rylance, Esquire." All Nicola could do was stare at the screen and wonder whether the rain had stopped outside, or how long had passed since she had knocked on Kerez's door, stared at the tiled doorstep, taken Steve's call at the Towner that morning. It all seemed to be spiralling into the shadows, time losing its shape and its structure, replaced with nothing but the all-consuming static hum of the machine, the horrid prickle on her face, the tang of metal in her mouth. "Restless in my disposition, I wandered the cobbled streets of Amalfi seeking solace in the sacred halls of the Duomo," Nicola read mechanically, aghast as the images on the screen jerked unnaturally through the haze of static, but unmistakably, impossibly, following and mirroring the words as she spoke them. There were the cobbled streets of Amalfi, filled not with tourists but with faint shadows of townspeople in 18th century dress, carts and wagons pell-mell across the narrow streets. Kerez would twitch on the controls and the image would change again. It was a dark, overexposed image on the screen, but Nicola knew it immediately as the inside of the Duomo di Amalfi, the high, tall windows casting shafts of light onto the cold stone floor. It looked like a photograph that had been photocopied over and over until only the barest jagged outlines of the original could be recognised. But it was an image nonetheless. Amidst the pulsing lights, a stumbling figure that must be Roger Rylance passed through the shafts from the window. To my perturbation, I beheld upon ancient wall paintings my own familial cognomen, Rylance, accompanied by the ancestral crest, the dragons quartered with the river. A vexation seized my soul, for no kin of mine had ever ventured beyond our English shores, least of all to this distant part of Italy. Kerez turned to look at Nicola, her eyes alive and mad and filled with a foreboding of knowledge that sunk terror into Nicola's soul. Her expression was inscrutable. Blood was starting to trickle from both sides of her mouth now. Thin wisps of smoke were rising from the control panel, and the groaning, seething noise from within the machine was growing louder and louder. "Can you get it yet, Nick?" Kerez hissed. "Have you opened the door yet?" Nicola was lost in a world of flaring, pulsing lights, the bitter tang of metal in her mouth, the sting of 1,000 pins of static on her face. Whatever the opposite of warmth and art and beauty and sunshine was, it was this dark pit of twisted illogic. There was a different image on the screen now. It was a small, stone-built room, an open window overlooking the moonlit sea, the high cliff faces of the Amalfi Coast stretching off into the distance. A figure was laying in the bed, twisted in the sheets, his face obscured by shadow and static buzz. As the sun descended, so did my vitality wane, and a sense of ominous surveillance besieged my senses. Nicola read, her voice quiet. In the throes of malarial fever, I beheld a spectral square, aloft, from whence two indistinct forms observed my affliction, as if a portal unto the infernal realms, a sensation akin to 1,000 pins piercing my flesh assailed me, the apparition vanished. Nicola's brain went dead, the last vestiges of doubt vanishing to be replaced by a horror that seeped into her bones. Her eyes flicked up from the page to observe the reflection of her and Keris stood side by side, overlapping the image on the screen of Roger in his bed. They stared at Roger, and he stared back at them, and Nicola knew that he could see through the screen, through the centuries, and was watching them observe him in a state of terror. The image faded away, replaced with aimless shots of the cliffs, the sea, the crumbling palazzos and churches of Amalfi. Keris's words from before rang in Nicola's ears. What if ghosts aren't just echoes of what has been? What if it works in reverse too? What if you can see an echo of days yet to come? You knew! Nicola sobbed miserably into her chest. Keris, you knew! You knew you had to build this thing! Because you knew that you already had! Because you read the will! You knew that Roger had seen you! You knew that he'd seen us! Keris nodded slowly. I guessed, she said softly, the kindest she'd sounded the whole evening. The moment I found the will in the archive at the Holborn, I remembered what Brune had told me, and I guessed at what Roger had seen. And the moment I guessed it, well, I suppose it was inevitable that I would have to make it so. Course of history and all that. Keris reached out her hand and grasped Nicola by the arm. It stung to the touch. Keris's palm red-hot and smouldering, steam rising from her hands. Keep reading, Nick, Keris breathed. You're nearly there. You've nearly seen. The door, it's nearly open. Nicola turned back to the will, now crumpled in her hands from where she had been balling her hands into fists of distress. Come the morrow, Mr. Greaves conveyed me along a narrow country path to the sanctuary of Ravello's monastery, where the pious monks attended to my ailing state. In the solitude of the infirmary once a hallowed chapel, I perceived more of the unsettling inscriptions, my own name etched into the very stone. Alone with my disquieted thoughts, the pin-like affliction returned, as I gazed upon an ancient font, embellished with a mosaic depicting a demon with bared fangs. As if on cue, the inside of a large chapel appeared on the screen. Nicola hadn't been to Ravello when she had been to Italy with Steve, but it hardly seemed to matter now whether she had walked in Roger's dying footsteps or not. Her terror had overwhelmed her brain, and she took it as gospel that what she was looking at was the inside of the Duomo di Ravello in 1774. Smoke was now billowing from the control panel of the chronovisor, the image flickering and jumping as the machine shook and roared. Keres seemed fixed in place, her withered body sinking into the caged chair, writhing and convulsing, blood pouring from her mouth, nose, ears, her eyes rolling up into her head as sparks arced across her body. "Read!" Keres screeched as she was engulfed by the acrid-smelling cloud of smoke, her ragged voice vanishing into the cacophony of shattering machinery. "Remember!" Nicola watched dumbfounded as Keres lifted her arms into the air, destroyed hands curling talon-like downwards. Roger's face appeared on the screen, covered in sweat, eyes wide with fear as they stared back directly at Keres. Nicola wrenched her eyes away from the bizarre spectacle before her, turning back to read the final page of the fragmented will clutched in her hands. Once again, the spectral square manifested, revealing a ghastly figure. A woman, half dead, hands bleeding, and a pallor resembling the cold clasp of death. My senses, ensnared in delirium, bore witness to her torment. She reared before me as a gorgon, hands clenched as talons, before in a moment she faded away, in an arcing of lights, like lightning in a cloud. A noise like a thunderclap shook the house. Paintings fell off the wall, their frames snapping apart on the floor like twigs. Roger's face disappeared from the screen with a burst of static, the image collapsing back into the small white dot, which then blinked out of existence. For a moment, the whole house was plunged into complete blackness. Nicola felt like she was floating, weightless, adrift in a bottomless void. The lights switched back on. Nicola found herself splayed on the floor, her eyes filled with the afterglow that comes with a bright flash of light. The outlines of Roger's wide-eyed look of horror were slow to fade from the surface of her eye. Nicola heaved herself to her feet and stared at where Keres had been sat. The cage-like chair was empty, a few thin wisps of steam rising from the molten wreck that had been the control panel, a faint glow from the depths of the wrecked screen of the chronovisor slowly dimming to nothingness. The static taste was gone from the room. Nicola stood completely still for a long time, her ears filled with the unnerving silence. After a while, she realised that she still had the last page of the will, scrunched up in her shaking fists. Gingerly, she unwrapped the crumpled piece of paper and read the scrawled writing upon it. In my madness, I confided all these harrowing visions to Mr. Greaves, and in my final moments, I deemed myself accursed for the dissolute escapades of my grand tour through Europe. I hereby bequeath to Mr. Greaves the solemn charge to burn all artworks amassed during our journey, lest the curse extend beyond the mortal realm. In witness whereof, I set my hand and seal this testament on the 22nd day of August, in the year of our Lord 1774. Signed, sealed, published, and declared by Roger Rylance, Esquire, as his last will and testament, in the presence of Mr. Greaves of Cambridge, who in his presence, and at his request, has subscribed our names as witnesses. Nicola stuffed the page into her pocket as she staggered down the hallway, trod over the lemon-patterned tiles of the doorstep, and ran down the road faster than she had ever run in her life. The sunshine had been gorgeous every day of her trip, and today had been no exception. Nicola allowed herself a satisfied smile as the warm Mediterranean breeze blew through her hair, threatening to cast her straw hat into the azure blue sea. She leaned on the railings of the ferry as it chugged lazily towards the jetty at Amalfi, tourists milling around in their shorts and sundresses, waiting to disgorge into the town to buy fridge magnets and pizza, and lemon sorbet served in an actual lemon the size of a coconut. It had been an odd 6 months for Nicola. She'd been off work for weeks after the incident with Keres, suffering a mouth ulcer that the doctors could only bafflingly compare to her being exposed to a malfunctioning neutron ray. As she wasn't, as she assured the multiple medical practitioners who'd come to interview her as she lay, sweating in her hospital bed, a mad scientist, she thankfully hadn't been arrested for handling radioactive materials. She told Steve about what had happened with Keres, of course, and he told the police, but the missing persons report that had been filed had yet to garner any leads. Even now, when her memories of that terrible night at the townhouse were so clouded by her sickness that Nicola couldn't tell where the truth ended and the hallucinations began, some part of her knew that there would be no trace of Keres Rylance to be found in 2024. Perhaps there was some pauper's grave in the sunny hills overlooking the bay she now sailed into that held Keres's bones, after she had become stranded in the past, carving her defunct coat of arms into the walls of the Duomo di Ravello for no other reason that she knew that she had already done so. Perhaps there was no grave to be found, and Keres had simply dissolved into the wavelengths that Nicola still was not convinced she had ever truly understood. The ferry pulled up to the jetty, and Nicola let herself be carried by the crowds all the way to the town square. It was the last day of her holiday, and tomorrow she would be back at Naples airport on a plane back to dreary Gatwick and another year at the Towner. She wasn't sure why she had been compelled to return to this part of Italy, after her glowing memories of it had been so poisoned by the ghostly visions of the chronovisor. She'd used art as her alibi, of course, explaining to her friends that she'd come to see the paintings, the archaeological museum in Naples. That wasn't it, of course. Maybe she wanted to fix it in her mind again, to remind her that it was a real place, not a phantom of the past. She wouldn't let the sunshine be dimmed, not by gloating boasting Keres of all people. The day was spent quietly enough. Nicola took in the preserved bows of the ships of the Amalfitian Republic in the Maritime Museum, ate her sorbet on the wide steps leading to the golden fountain in the town square, and then, with just a little trepidation, walked up those same steps to the Duomo di Amalfi. The character of the place seemed little changed to her from the last time she had visited in person. Nicola wondered to herself if this counted as her second or her third visit to the cathedral, as she wandered into the shadowed courtyard. It was quiet, the other tourists clearly sunning themselves on the beach rather than skulking around the narrow passageways of the corridors, observing the shattered husks of Roman masonry and Norman arches that protruded from the stucco walls. Finally, Nicola came upon the faded wall paintings, a series of washed-out pastel-coloured depictions of Christ, St. Peter, and assorted other crowds of glum-faced saints in majesty. The paintings were faded and chipped, and Nicola's conservator's eye knew that the slightest brush against them would dislodge a precious few more flakes of thousand-year-old paintwork. As she studied the paintings, Nicola could just about make out the faint traces of graffiti around the edges of the artworks, the markings of travellers and tourists from years gone by. They were, of course, mostly English, a phenomenon common in Italy. Entitled sons of the aristocracy debauching their way through Europe on the Grand Tour were inclined to inscribe their names onto whatever work of antiquity they came across. Nicola kneeled down, to the corner where she thought it must be. Memories of the pulsing, overexposed image from the chronovisor ran through her mind as she squinted. There. Just visible in the far bottom corner of a curved recess, Christ in majesty looming above it, arms outstretched, was a thin, worn set of scratches, almost worn away by time. A rough outline of a shield, quartered between crude depictions of a river and a rearing dragon, and beneath that, unmistakably, the words carved in an uneven, shaky hand. Rylance. Like stars popping into vision in the night sky, their wavelengths suddenly illuminated after one was spotted. Nicola could see dozens of Rylance family crests dotted around the cathedral. Not just in the obvious spots, where visitors tended to make their marks, but in odd, seemingly impossible to reach places. like the far corners of repurposed Roman columns, or the underside of a carved wooden pew. Whatever form Keres had taken once she passed through the monitor, she had made her presence felt in the Duomo di Amalfi. Even now it was like she haunted it. It was inevitable then that Nicola would find herself standing at the shorefront of Amalfi, at the narrow turning of the road that snaked along the steep cliff edge that faced the sea. She boarded the rickety bus that flew around the mountain passes with unsettling speed, seeming to accelerate rather than slow down as it approached corners. The bus weaved its way up the cliff face, through a tranny, before stopping at the large brick tunnel that led to Ravello. The town itself was, if anything, more picturesque than Amalfi. Tall green lemon trees swayed against the blue, cloudless sky. The handsome square of the town consisted of the crumbling edifice of the Norman Tower, a few small shops selling glazed tiles and bowls, and the Duomo. Nicola stared for a long time at the domes of the Duomo di Ravello. She hadn't come here the first time, but she had seen it before, on the monitor. It was unchanged in 250 years. There were no visitors at this Duomo. The single elderly warden at the front desk seemed surprised to see her, and seemed not to know how to issue a ticket, as though he were out of practice. Nicola could hear her footsteps echo around the cavernous stone walls of the church. The sunshine didn't quite seem to reach through the tall windows, and the shadows seemed just a bit thicker than they ought to be. Nicola passed display cases filled with misshapen silver reliquaries and chipped wooden effigies of the Madonna, and pushed open the door to the chapel. The chapel was dark, the last few strands of sunlight fading as the evening drew in. Nicola could hear the warden shuffling slowly in the rooms behind her, locking up the building for the night. She knew she didn't need long. She could see it from across the room. Nicola walked up to the font and took in all the details of the mosaic demon that the chronovisor could not convey. Its scales were teal green, its snake-like belly bright orange, the red, forked tongue hissing through white, scowling, jagged teeth, and black horns jutting from its narrow, dog-like head. A single, cold dark eye stared out at Nicola. The graffiti under the demon's beard was clearer than the rest, and in a different hand. "I can see you too. R.R. 1774 AD. Art as Alibi was written and performed by Isaac Hart. The music was by Kevin MacLeod. The script editor was Jennifer Rhiann Bartley. Ghost in the Museum will return with a new original story on the 26th of February. Thank you for listening. May we meet again.